many others.
Who are the directors of the film and producers. We've also got, let me do my introductions to make sure I properly describe everyone. We've also got Jake Hapgood, who's programmer and project manager for RetroUnlim and Sumo for 14 years. He's now the senior lecturer in game development at Sheffield Hallam University. And on my far right, Jamie Sefton, who's
not the far right, no.
who's ex-PC Zone editor, MD of Northern England Games Network, Games Republic, and is a fascist. So if we have a quick
blackers, black and white.
Absolutely. So let's see. I'm Rob Barker, by the way. I'm a narrative designer and writer. Thanks to Games for Tony for inviting me to join this. We've got 30 minutes. Like I said earlier, I'm acutely aware you've all been sat in the dark and you've probably got things that you'd rather be talking in the pub to your friends about what you've just seen with. So rather than us spending 50 minutes talking in that kind of slightly more rigid Q&A format, I'm going to try and bring you in early doors. We've also got a mic which Kat at the back has got. So I'll use that as a kind of conch to try and stop things from becoming crazy. But I'm sure you'll all help me kind of build something which works and isn't crazy, except in the very most positive way. So let's see. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions first of all about who you all are. So who here plays video games? Raise your hand. If you play video games. Keep an eye if you can see anyone who hasn't raised their hands. They're all up. Okay. Who here makes games in one shape, form, or another? Oh, okay. Definite emphasis over there. So that's interesting. Fantastic. Good. Well, I guess the first thing, if I just ask yourselves a couple of bits about the film. I mean, it's a film that takes as its subject the UK games industry from the 70s to now. But what was the story that you wanted to tell?
I think it was the fact that before we started the film, there didn't seem to be much recognition of the British games industry, and certainly what had gone on in the UK during the 1980s. And I think can you all hear me, by the way? Sorry, because we just moved the mic and I thought I unplugged it by mistake. We thought that there was basically ourselves. We were both, we grew up through the 1980s playing. I think it was on the Spectrum. I was Commodore 64, and I think it was just that we were one of many other millions of children that experienced that era. And I think by the sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, it just came to a point where we sort of started asking, oh yeah, what happened to that? It was like we were part of it. Suddenly we're in the middle of an explosion, and then suddenly it was like the dust cleared, and suddenly it was all this, so you're asking yourself what happened. And I think it was just some basic questions we wrote down on a piece of paper in the very early 2000s. Possible documentary idea. British video games industry, ? We've still got that somewhere actually, we've got an ideas book. And it literally was just, how did it get started? How did it, and then what happened to it? Because we noticed at that particular time that when we, as basic as it sounds, when we did some internet searching, US Gold were gone, IDOS was still around, but there were many of the other companies seemed to have disappeared.
When did you start looking at that and doing that research?
The idea for this actually started around 1999, because I remember we wrote we had a documentary ideas book. Some of them actually have been made, but and literally and absolutely truthfully, it was the second. I don't remember the first, but it was the second entry. It was just called documentary British video games story. Doc, 3 parts. I think we thought it would be a 3-parter.
It was originally going to be a TV show. We took to pretty much every TV station that we could for years and kept touting this. Every time we went in to see them, we always try and push this idea, but could never ever get it placed because we tended to find that the broadcasters didn't really get what it was all about.
It shouldn't like BBC 4 or something. You think that they would have, they'd have a lot of rock documentaries and sort of things, but
with gaming they just couldn't get it,
There was a real disconnect, actually. Disconnect. You would actually, you'd be sitting there with a commissioning editor and you would simply be saying, you know, if I was talking about doing a Beatles documentary, they would have an understanding of who they were, who the Beatles were, their significance on the music industry. But the problem was they didn't understand that there even was a British video games industry and that it was even significant. So you then had to do that education. So it makes the pitch really hard. So, and you've got a couple of minutes and it'll be, oh, you know, can we not, you know, is there not something else? Or they'd say sweeping comments like, oh, that sort of Pac-Man stuff. So then you then say, well, actually, that's not a British game. That's something, you know, you've got a completely sort of distorted version of it, and it was hard.
Well, I was going to ask you just one of like a couple of questions about the film and its filminess, if you seriously, before we talk about games and, like I say, kind of really sense in the audience. But were you influenced by any references outside of games? I mean, because from my point of view, the narrative that you explore here is one that's similar to, say, one of New American cinema or punk, all sorts of different cultural stories that I think share parallels in terms of that rise, fall and rise again, really. Did you look at any others?
I think somebody actually said to us, treat it as if you're doing a documentary on the rise and fall of the British motor car industry.
Okay.
It was a bit bizarre because you sort of thought, well, motor cars bring pleasure and excitement and all these other things, but the British video games industry, I think, as Andy Payne said at the end, it really is so unique because there's so many different types of people that come along. So we looked at it and thought, if this was being done for television, it would most likely have, because of the attitude that, not being negative here, but the attitude broadcasters have is that voiceover-driven piece where you just basically shoot a series of interviews and then you just basically put the interviews in and the voiceover links them all together. That would be a quick thing. We could have made From Bedrooms to Billions literally in 6 months. We could have shot 10 interviews, 15 interviews, gone for the usual people with the greatest respect, because some of them are actually in the film, like Peter Molyneux and Jeff Minters and things like that, and just made the film and structured it with the voiceover and then thrown the thing out. And we thought that...
Well, we wanted to actually hear from other pioneers, some of them that you don't really know so much, that maybe aren't all around now, and we wanted to give them a voice, you know. And we thought if we put voiceover on it, that's us linking it together. I mean, we know it's obviously too long at the moment, it does need to be cut down and everything, but we're trying to get a nice balance of a film, but also get everyone in there that we can.
I've just noticed David Jones sitting up there actually. He's probably thinking, where was my... The funny thing is, this is the classic example where we've got a central structure for the film, and then you then swap that head for that, and you gradually, because it's an ensemble approach, which is so time consuming, it's such a difficult thing to edit. So like David's sequences, we've got a sequence on budget, the rise of budget software, which sort of revolutionised the whole budget games and everything, and David's very much in that, and we've got a little bit more on some other computing and stuff, and it's making room when we had to even pull the credits. The end credits, otherwise I think our bums would have just gone beyond that. So it's still got to come down. It's still got to come down in time.
That's where you want to ask yourselves as well. There's a large number of stories there. I think the time is right for the story. I think you've got where we are now, obviously with the rise of indie gaming now again. You know, it's really From Bedrooms to Billions to Bedrooms. I think really would be a more apt title in some ways. But were there any stories that I guess were a surprise for yourselves, or that you kind of feel are still waiting to be told from the point of view of your own experiences?
I just felt like I was watching a whole movie, to be honest. It was kind of like my childhood, just, you know, it's like all the stuff about the spectrum and sort of programming. This is a program that I found the other day in a drawer, and it's like, you know, this is something I programmed in BASIC. You know, I used to just sit there typing programs into magazines, and from magazines as well, and you know, I collected Ultimate Play the game, and I was just obsessed with them, and it is a really, really good piece of work, and I think it was fascinating seeing the whole sort of side of it from the sort of bedroom side, and then also getting into stuff like the magazines side of things, which is, you know, where how I got into the industry through just writing for computer games magazines, because I was inspired by those magazines like Crash and Zap, and I remember being at school and we'd get the latest Crash and we'd be, you know, looking at the games and, you know, talking about it and getting excited about it, and I think that's that sort of passion and that sort of that whole era kind of has just sort of pushed forward, like I say, decades of influence, and And certainly from my point of view, that's why I wanted to get into the industry, because I loved games, but I didn't keep up the programming. It's like, well, how can I blag my way in? And it was through the writing side, so it was through being critical and writing about video games that I got involved. And that it was nice that you included the stuff about the Julian Rignall, all those guys that I when I meet those guys who worked on those magazines like Cheddy, and I'm kind of a bit in awe. It's like meeting football stars or something.
They were so important though, their magazines.
Yeah, because it was like you say, it's hard for, I don't know if there's anybody in here sort of young, I mean this young chap down here, days before the internet, it was literally the only way that you'd find out about new games and stuff coming out, because it wasn't covered in mainstream media. You couldn't sort of buy a newspaper and find it or look at it on the television. It was just ignored almost, apart from like sort of some geeky late night stuff on, with guys who look like sort of wearing white coats and look like kind of sort of quite creepy. And I remember actually the first time I properly saw a game on television was Ian Stewart with Monty Mole. And it was around the time of the miners' strike, and they were doing a lot about the fact that I think that the NUM leader Scargill was actually, I think he was in the game or something.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that was the first time I ever saw computer games on like mainstream news. I was like, my God, it was like I remember it so clearly, and like now I've got to know Ian as well. It's fantastic. But yeah, I think just a really interesting piece of work. And I think that, like you say, probably as a movie you could cut down to 2 hours, but you could easily release like a 4-hour sort of DVD director's cut, and I'd watch everything.
So Jake, from
Yeah,
your
no,
point of view,
I mean, I thought it was great. I thought the completeness of the story, when all the way through I was thinking, oh, I hope they mentioned this, I hope they mentioned that, and then you did.
Yeah.
I mean, I know Ian couldn't be here today, but there was a point at which I was sort of thinking, oh, if Ian was here, he'd be really pushing the point that, the British sort of stock market wouldn't invest in the games industry in the same way as America and France, and the whole story of Infogrames coming and buying the companies. And then you did explain all that, so I think that was really good as a piece of work.
We could have really stuck the boot in actually, because I mean, there's, what there was that when the buyouts happened. I mean, you really had. See, publishers tended to get, when you look at some developers would tell us they were ripped off, but that happens in many industries, and there's other developers that had that bit of luck that maybe succeeded. But publishers were a necessary evil. And then the publishers also then experienced so much trouble and so much issue that when it did get to that financial sort of collapse in the mid-90s, they did turn to the stock exchange because games were so much more expensive to make. And there were individual stories that we learnt about the way some of those companies were then subsequently broken up, the way that some of our British publishers were bought with the sole intention of just destroying them. Even Ocean suffered, within a very short space of time, they were destroyed. And Ken Wright goes on about that in great detail after, because he was part of the sinking ship after David Ward and John Woods had left.
I think.
sorry.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting that it still goes on as well. You still get American money and big money from abroad coming in, buying studios, messing them up, and then they split. They go kaput, and then it ends up with new companies coming out of it. So I think it's getting better. I think I run an investment event, and I'm very passionate about trying to get indies and small games companies funding. And it's getting better. I think investors now understand. There's a lot more angel investors like Ian Livingston, who's made his money in the industry and actually invested back into games now, which is fantastic. But I think there's still quite a lot of conservatism with investors as well, whereas in the US that doesn't seem to be as much of an issue as it is in the UK.
I don't think that's another thing why we put the sequence in at the beginning of the film about the eccentric behaviour of the British. We're all a bit crazy in a nice way, sort of mad scientist type thing. And some of you are probably thinking, am I watching the right movie? When you're seeing somebody diving a hang glider into the sea and everything. But there is that sort of creative pottery type garden shed sort of aspect, rather stick a relay board on than go and start a corporation attitude about us. And that's what I think happens. We're great at starting something off and building it up to a certain point. And a lot of us just want to go back and do the tinkering again. And when it gets to the point when you want to just make it commercial and build, become the billions, we sort of, we sort of lose that way. And all those publishers, Ian Stewart included, when it got to that point when it was time to sort of dominate the world, we sort of resisted the urge to do that and sort of lost our way.
Well, there's this incredible range of characters in the film. You've got people who are mavericks, you've got people who are careerists. You've got people who are like Del Boys. There's a lot of leather jackets in this film. I'd really like to talk about just in terms of the film. The
A lot
heroes.
of men as well, actually.
A lot of white dudes. Yes, that's a thing.
We do have
fantastic to have you on
Dawn
the panel
Hollywood's
to
to go in
try.
actually. Dawn
Yeah.
Hollywood's going in, and
Okay.
there's a couple there are, but again, it's still a tiny. And funny enough, some of the women. I mean, Ali's in there, Ali Noble,
And Mo.
Mo Warden, but there are. I mean, it's just one of the things. It was. You know, there's no getting away from
That's
it.
the sample, then,
Yeah.
I'm sure, absolutely. But certainly talking a little bit about those characters, I'd like to, Nat, who's got a mic there. Nat, can I just ask you to come up with the mic? Because I've got co-edited a Games Britannia fanzine, so anyone who kind of makes a contribution, could you hand them one of those? Which they might find a bonus or a reward for their contribution. There are some fantastic cats in the film. I think there's some fantastic villains as well. So I'd really be interested to find out from yourselves who you think the greatest hero and villain from the industry is. Pop up your hand and we'll have a mic pass you to tell us that. It may even be someone in the room. I don't know.
The villain isn't in it.
Well, I mean, there we go.
I will
get a mic
talk
just
about
so it's the person at the front there. That'd be awesome. You raised your hand there, sir. So yes, do far away.
Is this on?
Yeah, we can hear you
Okay.
guys.
I think it was interesting seeing Bruce Everest.
Oh, I thought we could get away with it.
No, you can't, because I've had my run-ins with Bruce.
So is he a hero or a villain, or is he both?
I think he's both.
Yeah.
I think in those days he was obviously very influential, and I think it's a bit of a shame that Bruce is very well known. If you surf the internet, find his Twitter account, it's quite amusing. But Bruce did a lot in those days, very clearly, and people were very understanding of that. But then he seemed to go on a crusade about 10 years ago to start rewriting history. And I would describe him as having a few problems.
Yeah.
But at the time, he was obviously very influential, and his marketing ideas made a huge difference. We all know those, remember those games and imagine play the game.
Do you mind if I just add something actually to that? Was that when you interview, as we've interviewed now, 149 people, what happens is some people will say that guy's a whatever, or this, and then what happens is when you gradually get 40, 50 people saying the same thing, there's a sort of a general sort of acceptance that that's the way it was. So if Bruce is saying that he invented the atom, or not the acorn atom actually, it was a bad analogy, but if he sort of said something which is way outrageous, you tend to find that there's a general sort of balance of opinion that guides the narrative back to reality. So, we sort of understand that sometimes people were quite, I'm not saying anybody in this film did that, or they did, you never know, but you tend to find that there's a balance of opinion. So, like, rather than one developer saying all publishers, rip you off, some developers say that didn't happen, that they did come across some publishers that actually helped the talent. That's why we put the section in which balances it out, so that it's also important that publishers invest in developers, because the publishers need the developers to create the product, so they need each other. But the developer will always the developer just wants to develop, but they need to live, they need to be able to eat, and they like to make a bit of money from what they do. So it's that balancing act. But that was one of the thorniest subjects, was the treatment of developers from publishers.
I think having a balance is great. I would actually like to see some slightly more awkward extreme views if you have them. Because I actually think it would help the film to show that, because it is there, you're right, but I think it could be made a bit more clear, because I know some of the characters there feel very strongly about the way things were treated, and I think people here know plenty of stories, and obviously you can't speak for them, but I would actually I think the film would benefit from showing that there was a real awkwardness at times between these two competing people who are making the money and people who are making the games in lots of cases.
Well, I think the panel would benefit from that as well. If there's anyone else who's got those kinds of awkward or interesting views on, I guess, the characters and the people involved, then give us a shout, raise your hand. Do introduce yourself, by the way, if you get a chance.
I'm from Rick Wales, my name's Andy. Been into games for 30 odd years, and I'm in the games industry, I've got a game shop. And we're writing different things for sort of Oculus Rift at the moment with a couple of kids locally, so it's really up my street. I remember standing in a shop in Enfield when I was about 19, and a really geeky guy came in, and it looked like a Lamborghini outside, and it was John Rickman. And he came in, and he knew we were making arcade games, and we were freezing Street Fighter games in the Trocadero, because there was a bug in Guile. He was overhead kicking the air and it would just freeze the machine out. And it was great fun. It costing them a lot of money, but it was fun for us. And he sort of came to us, and he came in with this Game Boy. We were all playing Tetris. And he came through the door with this huge cartridge plugged into it. And said, could you guys just have a go on this? And I remember thinking, oh, I'm so sort of proud that he's come to us, asked us to have a look at it. But what I got across from him was he was on very little wages. And he, you know, it was pitiful. And that's what, to me, what your film gets across is the passion that our British industry's got, and what Americans have got. They make our passion commercial, and that's what's happened to our industry. And I think that's what you've got across here is really, really good. But I think for an average user, we're the hardcore, so that's our love, as it were. But for an average user, I think you're going to have to break it down a little bit smaller, you know, and get it more, like the guy said over there, more. I don't know. You've got to put the egos in there. You've got to, because they exist. They form our industry and they form our life. And that's why we've got these supermarkets, pretty much like the big guys say, we're Nintendo. We want to go to these little shops because they give that service and that value added. And our industry's got it. But our government's failed us in our industry because we didn't have that back that supported us like the Americans did. And I know that from trying to sell games, you know, as an independent. You know, when it's mentioned games, you just go straight to the supermarket because price is king. But as I have to set up my shops, that's got a broad range of products, and I can do what they can't do. And I have to find that niche, which is what makes me very proud about that. You've got Jeff Minter making games on every platform, even up to Rift and iPad, and still innovative and playable, and he thinks outside the box. And the start of that film, to me, made me really sort of proud, because that's what we like. We will just keep tinkering, not to earn money, because we want to break new ground, you know, and that's perfect.
I think you're absolutely right. I think some very famous, well, not particularly famous, but famous in the industry, guy who ran a big game studio in the region. One of the first things he said to me when I met him was, if you get into games to get a Porsche, you're in the wrong industry. And what he meant was that you do it because you love it and you're passionate about it, and you know that's certainly all the people that I've met. They get into the industry. You know, if you make money at it, brilliant, and if you're good, money will come. I always think, but you initially get into the industry because you love it. You absolutely love it, and the people are also brilliant as well. And you kind of you get such a mix of people getting into the industry. I think it's still like that. Actually, it's one of the few industries where you can come from anywhere. It's like when I got into games journalism, I met people who are ex-roadies and who've been in bands, who've been doing all sorts of stuff, working in supermarkets, and it just you can do it. You can still get into the industry, and you do it because you're passionate about it. And
but I think the industry, it seems to me, watching your film, part of the success was down to the fact that there was that low barrier to entry. It wasn't a nil barrier to entry. I knew plenty of people who can afford as electricians when I was a kid. But if you were able to afford
BBC
that,
Micros for the posh kids.
Well, absolutely. Yeah.
Teachers, their kids always.
But that barrier to entry, or low barrier to entry, meant that you didn't just have engineers going into the industry. And I guess I'd ask yourself, Jack. I mean, do you feel that enough is happening? Do you feel that as someone who's teaching a course on creating games, do you feel as if you're getting that diversity of people coming in to learn and find out about it?
I guess it's probably a little bit different than it was back in the day. I mean, you would say that you would get all walks of life and people with very different kinds of skill sets coming to it. Once you kind of get down to a particular kind of course, I mean, we teach a game software development course, very technical, very much about the programming. There's perhaps a narrower set of people that are sort of taking those kind of courses.
So, I mean, that must be a problem then, because, I mean, we've just watched a film which demonstrated that the success there was down to an ability for anyone to get in there. I mean, are things that it's almost like Scratch and the like kind of really going to be able to do it? I mean, is the rise through Pi the answer?
Well, I guess this is where things like Games Britannia can come in. I mean, the drive by the government to get more people into computer science and using things like Scratch or GameMaker or any other device programming language that you can use to not just be technical but be creative with. then is another route into the indie game development community and to keep the industry going. Really.
Yeah. I
The,
mean,
the film is going to be touching on that as well. We removed that section temporarily, but we are looking at how kids are now being encouraged to program again. Back in like the BBC days, when I was at school, you sat there, you really got involved with the machine. Now they kind of just get told, oh, you can do PowerPoint and stuff like this, whereas it's not so hands-on.
yeah, I mean, the film's narrative is about this change from, a community, and, a community that works through physical spaces and so on, like computer shops, and then publishers come in, and then, like, you've got it in your titles. Kind of guys with 10-gallon hats, like menacingly marching towards the screen. It's terrifying when you first watch it.
We had to work very hard to keep that away from the Bradford and Bingley look, because and Dad's Army as well. When we drew it out originally, it looked like Dad's Army and Bradford and Bingley.
Absolutely.
Can I just say, actually, the gentleman there that raised the point about that, getting some of those egos in there and your others, I totally agree, and I think the film is a perpetual balancing act, because everything you add adds time, running time, and this is the thing. Like the computer shops, they were really important. And you think, why are shops important? But they were. The magazines were important. The availability of cheap hardware were important. The creativity and the British sense of eccentric creative need, and all of these facets. But there was a section that we had which we pulled recently, not pulled as in like it's never going to be seen, but it'll probably be on some extended version or something like that. Sorry, it's a little bit more thought out than that, but and it's to do with the fact of where the first and second wave of developers lost interest and was stifled around 92, 93. As you heard, and in the film, the only real bit that we showed in this sequence was when Steve Turner talked about the fact of the joy was going, because all he was doing was he was cap in hand to the publishers all the time. And there was an element of exploitive behaviour from certain publishers who were thinking they're really into it, they're really creative.
But also they were influenced and like looking at a game and saying, oh, can you do this, can you do that? And that we need to put more of that in the film. We know that because the developers were saying, well, we want to be able to have our own creativity. Yet publishers come in and saying, look, can you do me a football game? Can you do this? Because they just sold 1 million of that, and that's worked.
Yeah, a producer saying, for example, a producer with very little game or no game experience whatsoever, who might have been working in the record industry that's gone in, or whoever it might be, saying to developers with 10 years of experience, like Graft Gold, for example, oh, that 3D tank game you're doing, it needs to be a racing game now. But they're all shooting. Yeah, it doesn't matter because racing games sell, so we need a racing game. So then developers are not doing what they do best, which is making games that they would want to play. They're being led by marketing decisions, and that's again a point in the mid-90s where suddenly a lot of the British creativity, they just thought, oh, I'm going to go, this is just a waste of time.
And that's obviously clearly still here. I mean, just a question for the audience: who? It's one for the game devs, I guess, but anyone, I'd love you all to respond to this one. Raise your hand if you'd rather be developing video games in 1984 than 2014. Oh my word. So Dave Jones' hand went straight up there. Could you expand on that, David? Pass your mic and a copy of the zine there as well.
Yeah, I'll stand up as well. For myself, back in the day, 85 in fact, is this actually on?
We can hear you, so yeah. It's handy, it's like a conch, because it stops everyone from all coming.
When I was writing games for Mastertronic, but at the start of it, not at the very start, after the rubbish games went through, but when I actually started getting some reasonable stuff and I sort of got involved, I actually would be working at home and I sort of get to a point in the game where I started to get a bit bored of it and I wanted to sort of just get some feedback. So I'd go into the office and I'd start telling them the game's going to have this, it's going to have that. And on one particular occasion I remember they said to me, look, we don't care what's in the game, you write it, we'll sell it. And these days it's like you have to amber light, green light, then you've got to sort of go back through the process again.
I think you do with publishers. I think the opportunities for indies are as good as they've ever been. I mean, it's incredibly. You can now, as a bedroom developer, you don't have to leave your bedroom. You can do it all, program it, and do everything. and release it digitally. I think that that's been the massive thing, certainly for the companies in our region. I mean, you talk to Charles Cecil, who's on that documentary, and he'll talk about the dark days of the sort of late 90s, and where they would get Revolution would get 5% royalty on Broken Sword games that never see any money. And then now they get 70% of their funds from releasing Broken Sword on iPhone, and it comes straight back in. They can use that money to develop new games, and I think that's been the huge change. I think obviously it brings its own problems because there's now millions of games out there on different formats, and it's that visibility. But I don't know. I think you'd have to be crazy to think to go back to the early 1980s as preferable to what it is now.
It was fun.
I think that's it. But I think it still can be fun.
These days it's a job.
Well, I don't think so. No, I think you can talk to us.
Yeah,
Yeah, talk to these guys.
Our designer can do whatever he wants.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think there are. This is it. The industry's so big now. It's kind of, you get your AAA and you also get your tiny games, that are released, and there's everything in between. And I think that's what's so wonderful. There's everybody plays games now. I think back in those days you had to make games that basically teenage boys would play, whereas now you can do anything, dance games and stuff like that.
But that said, if you look at the, I don't know if it was, well, obviously every choice in terms of the film you've made is deliberate, but I noticed when you were talking about the bigger games, the first game you showed was a Hitman game, which included guns, people being shot in the face, objectification of women, ticking all those boxes. Were you? Did you? It was deliberate. Yeah.
In fact, when we created a
so these are the bigger, better games that one of your talking heads was talking about.
Well, when you look at the tentpole games, you see, this is really interesting. Phil Harrison, we got Phil. I mean, he's quite a major player. He launched the 3 PlayStations. Now he's at Microsoft. He was unbelievably candid. I mean, I was really shocked. We were very shocked at how open he was and how frustrated he is with the industry, and how not frustrated as if like he's like losing. It's not for him. That's why he said about the tentpole games. He said it worries me because he said, but we are seeing less of them now because they're too risky to do, and small to medium publishers are looking at smaller games, and everyone cites Angry Birds all the time and things like that, which was very handy. Because it's shown a lot of smaller developers that actually I can write something better. Because it's not about the graphics. You don't have to go for 3D anymore. You can go for a retro look if you want, and that's why you've got that freedom.
I think the best example is Minecraft. I mean, that is made by somebody who's passionate about games, wasn't really bothered about making a lot of money out of it. He wanted to make something, made a load of games beforehand, came up with Minecraft, and that's just become a phenomenon really. And he's had to kind of build a business around the game, but it came out of him wanting to make a game, release it on PC as well. I think that's something that the PC has been massively important in certainly building indies before with Steam and certainly before iOS, and the iPhone kind of kick-started the whole mobile stuff. I think that PC was massively important, and it still is today, with releasing indie games.
I was talking about that balancing act in the film of like how much screen time you can give things, and giving them in such a way that they make sense, because if you cut them down too much, but the 16 bits, there's not a lot of coverage of them in the film, and I mean I was I used the 16 bits as much as I did the 8 bits, and there were so many great 16-bit games that we wanted to include, but with regards to the relevant to the industry, they were just the next stage. They just showed that the games became more advanced and we needed bigger teams and longer dev times, and that was the next sort of stage. And it showed that the relevance to the individual coder. It was about how they suddenly it was very, very difficult. That's why we showed I think it was Lamatron. Even Jeff told us the story about Lamatron. It took him so long to make it because it was in the Amiga, and he realised that I can't knock out an 8-bit game. This is going to take 3 times as long.
So Jeff Minter's latest game is on Vita now, TXK, and it's brilliant. It's probably his best game ever, and I think that's what's so wonderful. It's like kind of having comebacks from rock stars or something. All these guys are coming back and making, so often doing their best work, and I think that's wonderful, and they get paid for it, which is really even better.
I couldn't actually find a single, not that we looked, but there was a question we asked every interviewee, including David there. Was about a commercial aspect. Did you get into, when you started, when you were attracted into the idea of developing, was there any sort of idea of commercial aspect to it? And it was always no. You know, it was just I did it because I liked it, and then it eventually became eventually became a sort of the money came later, but it was always the love of it. And I think when you lose the love isn't there anymore. You don't feel excited about getting up and going to work and doing that. Then it's hard to be creative.
I think you find that with indies as well. I think a lot of them start out, you know, talking to all the guys in the region. You know, they start up and they, you know, release a few games and it's fun, and then the business kind of starts to take over, and they spend more and more time with spreadsheets and accountants and lawyers, and it takes them away from actually their love of programming and actually making the games. And I think you see it in the bigger sort of stars like Peter Molyneux. I think the reason why he kind of left Microsoft is because he would just want to get back to small teams making games.
He does say that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that to me seems, I think I alluded to it earlier, now is the time to tell this story, because you've got this brilliant full circle. But another question for the audience. Oh, hang on, there was a hand there. If you could just bring the mic over. do just ask. I've got a question for all of you as well, which I can give you in a tick. I think we're getting fairly close to the end now, but if everyone keeps their
I'm
questions
Adrian Mills, I
quite
teach game design at University of Grimsby Institute. One of the things, just to comment on what you were saying there, sort of thing, one of the things you did put in the film was the comment, I can't remember who said it in the film, because there was a lot going on, was the mention of the fact that they just went for licensed games towards the late 80s.
Ocean?
The guy from Ocean, wasn't it?
Yeah, Ocean
So
started
you tried
the
to
trend.
try to get hold of everything.
Yeah.
And then he said you dropped the sequence where the guy said in 92 they were just getting out because they were fed up. Was that a direct consequence, and was that a direct consequence of the people, you know, losing the love for making the games because they were just being forced into this licensed?
I'll be honest with you. You still find if you go with the Ocean interviews that we did, if you tended to go, you know, Ocean is a good example actually, a very creative, a lot of fun, excitement, really good hub of clever people. But if you handed them, say, this is a Platoon license, they'll just do the best game they can. So it doesn't always, it's not necessarily they're limited in that way. They'll still try and do the best game they can and enjoy themselves while making a game, whether it's Platoon or whether it's an original title. I think where you started to see the loss of it, Peter Harrop, for example, tells a really moving story about in this sequence which will probably be an extended, it's just too long. But Harrop says, you know, he just said he got out when he got fed up with people that he had no respect for telling him how to make games.
It was the money men when they started coming in. Quite a few say that was really influencing what we were doing.
And
they wanted to get
the
out
money
there.
men were becoming more desperate because, for the overriding reason that you saw in the film, because there was less money available for the publishers to exist. So they were becoming more desperate and more graspy. Let's do a racing game, let's knock out this game, let's do that. So the whole thing was, so it's part of a sort of, it was going through a dying process at that point. But it didn't die altogether, but it was those first wave and second wave of developers found it so difficult. I mean, Jeff himself, he stayed individual, stayed independent, so he sort of has gone up and down. Now he's going through a resurgence because now it's perfect for him, this sort of creative time. But yeah, it's
the film in a way seems to have him as the golden thread throughout. He's such an interesting figure, I think, for the film.
So many people talk about Jeff Minton.
I remember buying
Yeah,
a
they
game.
do.
I remember buying a game from I think it's Rocks 3. I think it's like an asteroids clone at the Personal Computer World show in London at Earl's Court, you know, in the mid-80s, and you know, I just met him there, and it's still doing so.
Terrifying seeing the Fisherman as well, because it doesn't really seem to have aged a huge amount. Whereas the gentleman from Ocean appeared to age just over the course of telling the story, which I'd imagine would be something that happened.
everybody talked about Jeff. Everybody said that because Jeff was on the early internet of the time, and you would ask him. Everybody, David Darling would.
David Darling said he just used to ring everyone up, but he would ring Jeff Minter because the only way they had to talk to one another was to call them up. So how did you do this? How did you do that?
Archie McLean would say, "I'll ring Jeff," and it'd be literally, "I'll ring Jeff," and Jeff was always
It's just
available.
all in the same office. Do you know what I mean? It's quite remarkable.
And he'd be on the net late at night as well. So you could. Mo Warden would say, like when Paul Wokes was working on Damocles, he said that, you know, he'd ask Jeff something about some real sort of high-level piece of code information, and he'd implement it into the game. And Paul Wokes was somebody we really tried to get, and I really wanted to do it because I'm a huge Paul Wokes fan. So it was a pain There's always a couple that got away.
I was going to say, how did you get on with the stampers? Did you get anywhere near?
We did. I mean, it's I've tried everything. We've had some.
You try and climb over the big iron gates, like
Yeah.
very Hilly Cop style kind of iron gates.
We've done all we can. I mean, it got to the point where we were going to start to get lynched by backers of the film. If, you know, we had to close the interviews off, and we had a couple of leads. And we had a couple of near misses. Everybody seemed to know them. You'd always get, somebody would write to post something and say, the film would be a failure if you don't have the stampers in it. And I sort of think, well, they were important, and we do feature them in the film, but it's wrong to say that one individual would ruin the film if they're not present. Because, you know, and Andrew Braybrook, for example, he's just not comfortable being filmed. Not everybody feels, you know, and as we got across in the fame section of the film, you know, they're not rock stars, but the magazines portrayed them as rock stars. They were, you know, I use this word really kindly, but geeks, nerds, as Jeff Minter said.
We claim them
programmers, you know.
Yeah,
Jake, were you about to?
Yeah, I just wanted to try and make a link back to Games with Channel on the question that was asked about licences. I mean, there is a lovely workshop that's going on with Mossy Monsters as part of Games with Channel later on, and we have Tony Crowther in the room who worked on that. So I thought it might be good to address that question to him, having worked on, you know, many of his own creative games over the years. You know, what was it like to work with that?
Yeah. I've always enjoyed it. I've always followed the trends. I've always like jumped on the bandwagon. Like my first game I did, Blagger, which was a copy of Manic Miner, and I've just moved on. So people will do this, and I'll go, I want to do that. I'm still doing that now. So we're still sort of copying, but making it better.
So you got no issues with working with the Washlings? Or?
No, it's quite fun. The kids, I've got youngish kids, but they've got a bit too old now. They're about 16, so they're not that impressed. It's watching.
My kids will be, so.
Tony, you were the first. I didn't know you. We didn't know you were here. It's fantastic because you were the first interview that we shot. So it's really quite funny that, you know, it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That shot we lined you up in front of the Commodore 64, and then we went and did Ian and Peter straight after. But you were the first. So you were the first interview. It's kind of funny you're here. So
Were there any questions?
because yeah, and I hated the film.
Were there any questions that have been through that process you missed out on asking, as it were?
Well, we tended to do the interviews in clumps. So you research. I mean, we thought, you know, we knew lots about it, not that much compared to what we know now.
Yeah,
But we do clumps. We'd shoot, we'd edit up, we offline. So we, you know, like a huge amount of stuff, and then we go and shoot more, and then we're looking for more. I mean, in fact, we told everybody that we'd actually finished filming ages ago. We filmed Phil Harrison only 2 weeks ago. We've been trying to get Phil for a long time. And then gradually people started to come in when they realised it was a real thing.
Sure. Well, we're definitely running out of time, but no one's checking us out. So I'm going to ask. Oh yeah, you had your hand up there. If we can bring the mic over there for a quick question.
Hi, my name's Dave. I work for RetroUnlim. I think you guys did some sort of live cast with them quite a while back.
We did, yeah.
Yeah, with Harry Eck. Yeah. I'm here on behalf of them. I think you kind of touched on it, but I was wondering, did Peter Molyneux kind of say anything outrageous that never really came about, or anything whilst you were interviewing him?
It was hard to cut. We had almost too many outrageous things to cut out. If we ever release, and do you remember he signed his appearance form like that? But I mean, he told us a story which was videoing this, which was where he told us about the fact of, you know, when he first started off, he was in the sort of crappiest flat possible, working on his Amiga, and when he was working on Populous, the toilet was broken, and they never bothered to fix it, so they were peeing in the sink.
Right.
So basically, it'd be like working on Populous, peeing in the sink, go back and do a bit more, and you know, I think the other thing is the amount of you know, people would often say, "Oh, we got drunk," but actually there was something else going on. And funny enough, there'd be an alternate version of the film, wouldn't it, if we put in the drug stories that we could really. But does that really show? If anything, we were trying to be careful about. We didn't want to sort of go and put in loads of drug references because we sort of thought that, you know, we're trying to sort of portray that this was a major. Something to be proud of in British history, and we don't really want anybody sort of getting on the bandwagon and saying, "Oh, they were all at the stones."
It's all in the source code.
Do you know one common thing was the number of developers that say, but when you're stoned and then you write code, it's crap when you look at it the next day. But then you debug it and work it out. So it was actually quite. It was alright if you were playtesting.
I'm not going to name names. Some people put comments through their source code, and they actually tell stories without the source code, but it's when they're high. So when anyone reads it like a couple of months later, it makes no sense whatsoever.
A section we're definitely popping in though, as an extended feature, is the one on piracy. You notice it just didn't get touched on at all, and it's because it's such a great section. And it's
Lots of Bruce contributions on that one.
on piracy, yeah, but I mean, everybody had a comment on it, and no one could be sure. It was a 50-50 split. Did it help the industry or did it harm the industry? And everybody's got a different opinion.
Well, let's take that on to the audience. Did it help the industry? Raise your hand.
Ah,
I mean, it was
Wow,
all-
that's really interesting.
yeah.
What period?
Sorry, in the 80s. 80s.
80s.
especially
Free to
column.
play, if you think
And
about it,
raise your
free to
hand
play.
if you thought it hurt the industry in the 80s. Not a single
That's
hand.
interesting.
That's amazing. Okay, let's get very, very quick one-sentence answer from each of you. What would you like to bring back from that 80s home development scene? Jamie will go from this end. Anything. I would say video game shops and fairs.
I'd like the Stampers back again, making games for Rare and doing like some classic games again. Because I'm a huge kind of Ultimate Rare fanboy, so I'd love to see them come back and do something. But I think they're just on a big yacht somewhere or desert island or something. But I'd love to see, because they were such influential figures, and it'd be nice to see them come back and do something else and set up a new indie thing or whatever. But yeah, that'd be cool for me.
I think for me it's just the kind of really quirky British games that used to be around, and that it's not
Do you
that
not
they
think
don't
those are
exist. No, I mean they do exist in some form today, but hopefully with the tax breaks and everything, so there'll be an even bigger revival of that sort of thing. So.
Tax breaks, yes, one thing. It struck me a couple of times watching this. I mean, for television, we've got the BBC. Does anyone ever? I'm in a room full of people here. Does anyone ever think that we do well to have the equivalent of a BBC for video games here? Where
We do, it's YouTube.
it's
Yes.
YouTube. Okay.
Absolutely right.
There you go. Okay.
Absolutely right.
Ned, what would you like to bring back?
I'd like to see kids back programming again, youngsters. I think that when we've not covered so much in the film that we showed today, but there's quite a lot of stuff we've got in a section that we're going to put in there talking about how we're getting kids back into it, and we do look back on it, how it all started. So I think that I'd like to see him sitting there pulling computers apart and really getting.
We'll see. And what have you got?
Well, I know there's a rose-tinted specs element when you sort of look at certain, when you go back and you look at certain 8-bit games and everything. But I think it's exactly the same thing. I think I'd like to see there's a section in the film which we actually pulled 2 days ago that we were going to put in. It was just made it too long. It was on the fact of this huge gap because of ICT. I know you said one sentence, but basically we lost almost a decade of new programmers coming through because they lost interest at the sort of 5, 6, 7 years of age, and there was actually a drop in the number of IT graduates. So we suddenly lost this huge thing. So I want to see, like my son Thomas there, when we went to a show recently, there's all this PS4 stuff, and he got drawn towards Chucky Egg, which he'd never seen before. And it wasn't me going, go on, go over there, go and look at the retro stuff. He just sort of saw the simplicity of it, and it doesn't matter. It's the playability and how it looks and all that. And I think that
And how you can just dip in and play for a little while. We don't get time to sit and play these big games that require hours of your time.
I
don't
think
get time to play
Because
games.
mobile games brought that back. Things just like an example like Flappy Birds. I mean that is. I can imagine Mastertronic releasing that in the 80s or something. You know what I mean?
There's this
it's
interesting
very
kind of commonality because the generation coming up don't have that attention span, and the older generation don't have the time. So we're all like united in this like need for kind of small experiences. Let's just pitch this one out to the audience as well. What would you like to bring back? Sentence or so. Raise your hand if you've got something you'd like to bring back. Otherwise, I'm going to take it that you assume you're happy to be in 2014. We'll get to know you. Bring in a new voice.
One sentence, the thing I'd like to bring back: high score music, proper video game music.
For that table.
Yeah, because it died a death. Now you auto log into games. They know who you are before you start. The opening theme of games is kind of lost in this sea of orchestral stuff, and proper video game music, synth music, featured composers that really pushed the limits of a technical machine and a chip. But also, there was a score for everything. When you died, you got a little bit of music. When you started the game, you got a little bit of music. there was an opening, there was a loading theme. You don't get those anymore. I was speaking to John here about this, and he said that the high score music in video games died and disappeared, and nobody noticed. So I would bring that back, because I think that's one of the great things that we've lost.
Or loading screens.
And
I
loading screens,
miss
yeah.
loading screens, actually.
And also, I'd just quickly like to say thank you, Anthony, because what you've provided me and anyone else in games education is at least 3 or 4 lessons worth of video there that we can use and we can show to our students and repeatedly say, listen to us. We've arrived. Thank you very much.
An intro from you, actually. I think I grabbed one.
Sorry, I'm Graham Ruddings. I'm a principal lecturer at video game design at the University Centre Grimsby.
Can I add one last thing, actually? It's actually very, very important to think about this on record, is that the film would only actually be possible. Yes, we went out and obviously made it, but we could only afford to do it because basically people funded it. We crowdfunded it. We couldn't get finance through traditional means. We couldn't get a single broadcaster to even consider it. So it was actually the community. We put it out. We went to Indiegogo and then Kickstarter to raise the money to make the film, and that's why we wanted to make it. We didn't want to do another one. It had to be, you know, the best and get everything shot and as much in it as we could. So we wouldn't have been able to do it without you guys. You know, I'm sure there's people here in this room that back the film. So thank you. You know.
Well, yeah, thanks very much.
I'm going to upgrade now. Special edition.
Plants. That's what we were talking before. For the screening. Is the
best £1 over here.
That would be a great point to finish on. But at the same time, no one's chucking us out. Why don't we just keep going until everyone just starts chucking stuff at me and I'll stop there. Because there may be other questions. Let's just open up into a general Q&A. Raise your arm if you've got a question. We'll bring a mic over to you.
You're asking about what it would be good to go back to. I'd just say the simplicity of things. Do you think the kids of today would get the same satisfaction about moving things around on a screen after reading the technical manual about which registers to poke, that sort of thing? Everything seems too complex these days and too overwhelming.
I'll tell you what was fun for me actually when, because I grew up typing in code from magazines, so when I got a job on the official PlayStation 2 magazine, at the time you could get YAR Basic on your PS2. So as a bit of fun, I just thought, wouldn't it be brilliant? You know, people spending 400 quid, 450 quid on this new PS2. Why don't we bring back typing in code into the magazine? So for the first year of official PlayStation 2, I ran a little column about YAR Basic, and I worked with the Sony guys, and we came up with a little Defender-type shooter that you could type in on your PlayStation 2. And probably only about 10 people in the whole of the UK did it. But it was great fun to do, and I kind of did it almost as like a sort of taking the mickey sort of thing out of it really, and also kind of to bring it back, and I just thought, I wonder if anybody's sad enough to still do that, and they were. But it's great, and I think that's great. I think kids nowadays, they can do that. I think it's, you know, there's so much more opportunity with Scratch and Game Maker and all these other things.
Did you see though, in the film, as Tony said, Tony Crowther said that it wasn't about games for him, it was about programming, learning to program. And also when Nigel Alderton said that the teachers were shocked that the kids were asking to come in early to use the computers. They couldn't get their heads around it.
We used to run riot, you know, we used to know more than the teachers, so we programmed them the BBC micros so that every time you pressed a button it said something offensive. And they just didn't know how to, you know, oh my god, we've broken the computers. And
I think that's
you know,
the thing though, because the computers were a tool that allowed you to, in a way, have more power.
Well, I think that's the thing about programming, is that it has its own internal logic, and it's incredibly liberating to think of something and then be able to create it immediately and think, right, okay, I'll do that and do that. And I think that it's incredibly addictive.
I think you can see it in Minecraft a little bit now, where we've got certainly you know, a little bit about how popular that is with in particular school age kids. It's almost like a parallel learning environment that teachers sometimes are completely unaware of. And in some cases, I think children are learning as much from Minecraft and the working that they are from some of their teachers.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's what's wonderful now, is that we are accepted as an industry. When I first joined the games industry in the late 90s, we were very much seen as kind of, you know, with Daily Mail headlines of, you know, we're teaching our kids to kill and all this kind of stuff. And it was very, you know, politicians wouldn't touch us with the barge pole, and it was seen as very much we're kind of pariahs almost. And it's completely turned around now. You know, the government love us. They'll actually listen to us. They've brought back, you know, computer science into schools. We've got a cross-party committee.
Because they've worked out how much revenue has been lost.
Well, I just think that's a coincidence.
Any other questions from the audience? Raise your hand. We'll go around to you Chap here at the front, and then we'll get to yourself just slightly further back.
I did that your basic thing.
Oh, brilliant!
Thank you. I should
You
do that.
sagged it.
I know. I did it on the pad as well. It took me forever.
Yeah. Oh, excellent.
My question is actually a film-related question. With the way people like watch things now on like YouTube and Netflix, did you consider not making it a film? Because I love the detail that's in it, but as a film, it makes it too long. But I still want the detail if it was in smaller chunks.
Well,
I think it's made, like our background, that what we are is filmmakers. So ultimately, as well as we want to see it up on the big screen.
you need to have you see, there's the people that, in order for the story to sort of propagate and go out and get out there, you need to have the one thing that people say, oh, from bedrooms to billions, that story about that, and then if they're interested more, they delve in. The problem that we have is it just takes so much time to make stuff properly. There's YouTube is fantastic, and there's great, you see interviews with Jeff Minter and Tony Crowther, all sorts of people out there where they've been videoed at an exhibition or a show and everything else, and that's important and it's really great. But if we want to put something out, you can put up an interview for 20 minutes of Peter Molyneux talking about his urination stories and other things.
There's lots of them.
Mark Healy telling us about how he worked for 4 days straight on a game at Bullfrog and then did a white poo. So drained, just nutrients, drinking Coke and coffee, Coca-Cola, and coffee and everything else. But we could stick the interview out as a 25-minute clip onto YouTube or whatever. But that's not really. We would rather edit it and make it so that it's actually a really decent piece. So what we intend to do is create the film, put the film out there, and then if there's a love for it, we'll continue to make things, because obviously we're like developers in a way. We're not a big publisher. It's taken a lot of our time and our own personal money on the film as well. It's been everything for 2 years.
We always thought that if we did have like that 2-hour movie, when we get it set, there is so much other material, and we will then work on getting that all released as well.
Brilliant.
People think it was too long. I thought that the length was just right. I could get watching them.
I think for this audience, it's
well, we could do something really mean. Put your hands up whose bum was numb at the end of it. I think there's bits that the gentleman there made a very good point. There's a scene I was thinking, funny enough, that exactly that point when we were on that bit in the early 90s. So there's bits that we want to just add in and improve and trim, but it's nearly there. But yeah, it's probably a tiny bit too long. Certain broadcasters wouldn't take it if it's length as well, which is would be frustrating. But yeah, for the core fan, we'll make more content if people want to see it.
I think our hope is that it will appeal to other people outside, like the gaming world, and that like my mum would sit down and enjoy it for 2 hours, and that, and people who maybe just don't know much of the story. And we felt that if we did make it too long, they may just switch off at points, and that we wouldn't want that.
And you have to tell the story. We have to get the story out there. There's always bits like we sort of feel it. But when we weighed it up, we thought piracy or computer shops. What really was the most important? Well, computer shops was all part of funneling that. Yeah, exactly.
Let's get some more questions. Dave, you just a really quick one for yourself, sir, because obviously you're an important voice, but I want to get other people as well.
The government representative recently, a month or so ago, who was claiming that you could learn programming in an hour. She would have done well to watch this, to actually have the faintest idea, at least, well, not saying the faintest idea, to have a background. She knew absolutely nothing. You should have watched something like this, would have given her a good introduction to it. Anyway,
we've actually, we've basically had, I'm being careful when I say this, but the film really, truly is 100% independent. We've not had any sort of, we wrote to the government ages ago and said to them, would you, we're looking to do this, because I don't know if you're aware of this, but we want to donate the film free of charge to every school in the UK. We've always said that. We've been on record and said that before we even did our first ever crowdfunding campaign, that when we're done, we want the film to go out to schools. So every school gets a copy of it, so that if they want to, we can't force them, obviously, to show it to them, but hopefully there'll be some geek teacher that say, look at this, kids, this is the way it used to be. But, so we thought it's a piece of history, and then it gets out there, rather than us trying to sort of hold on to it in that way. So, but we never were able to get any sort of response. But maybe that we wouldn't have been able to make the film in this way if we had. Maybe it was meant to be that we were supposed to be independent.
Let's just see, were there any hands still raised? Or talking about appearances, I was talking to a projectionist and he was kind of going, their soundtrack's going to cost a lot of money.
It's not too bad.
Is it okay? Just from a purely technical
Well,
point of
first of all,
view.
there's Max sitting there. There's a huge amount of the music. I don't know if everyone knows this, but a huge amount of the music was actually specially composed for the film. And we've had the fantastic Max Hall has been a massive linchpin in creating that music. We've got original compositions from Rob Hubbard, from Ben Dalglish. We were hoping Martin Galway, but he's been so busy on Star Citizen that it's just been proving to be very difficult. But there's been some other contributors, sort of Stuart Dugdale in there now as well. My brother is a composer who's added some stuff. So there's
British IBM.
I'd say 80%, maybe even 90% original music, especially for the film. We've got a couple of classics in there, but New Order, for example, we have to show the film to the management before you can get permission to use it and then agree a license. So a lot, and the same as well with certain video game footage. There's a lot of missing footage in the newer section of the film, simply because it will help now Phil Harrison, and we've got Sony involved now, so we can get permission on certain bits of footage, but we can't go and stick it in because we don't own it. And now we can show them a film and say, there's a cut. We're hoping they'll probably want to have something in it, if you know what I mean, rather than, it doesn't make any sense to them to deny it. So.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for all of you for coming. It's fantastic. I'm going to ask for a quick round of applause for our panel, and we'll see you in the bar.